Beatrice Leopoldine Victoria of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was born into a world that still believed itself unshakable. She was the child of three empires: the British monarchy, the Russian Tsardom, and the German duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. In her blood converged power, tradition, and dynastic expectation. Yet, her life would not be defined by triumph, but by the gradual disappearance of that very world. As a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and Tsar Alexander II, Beatrice stood at the very center of Europe's ruling houses at the end of the 19th century. Her existence connected London, St. Petersburg, and Central Europe at a time when monarchies still shaped the course of history. But as she grew up, the foundations of that system began to crack. Wars, revolutions, and courtly intrigues transformed her privileged birth into a fragile inheritance. This is not the story of a forgotten princess. It is the story of a woman who became a witness to the collapse of an entire era, and whose life quietly reflects how the old Europe came to an end. Beatrice was born on April 20th, 1884, in England, yet from the very beginning her identity extended far beyond a single nation. Her father, a British prince of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and her mother, a Russian Grand Duchess, raised her with the consciousness of belonging to Europe rather than to one country alone. Her early years unfolded between English tradition and German order. When her father inherited the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the family relocated, and Beatrice's upbringing took place within a disciplined, multilingual environment. English remained the language of intimacy and memory. German shaped her daily surroundings, and her mother's Russian heritage lingered as a constant presence. This brief yet formative period laid the foundation of her character. Beatrice learned to move with ease between cultures, to meet expectations without open resistance, and to endure tension without display. She did not grow up in isolation, but at the intersection of European power. The ability to adapt, learned in childhood, would later become essential for survival as political upheavals and personal trials reshaped her life. Before Beatrice reached adulthood, her youth was overshadowed by profound loss. Within a short span of time, the sense of security that had defined her early years began to fracture. The death of her brother, who had been the family's expected heir, deeply unsettled the household. Soon after, her father also passed away. With him disappeared not only a central figure in her life, but the stable framework that had structured her world. These events forced Beatrice into early maturity. What might have been a sheltered transition into adulthood became instead a period of restraint and quiet responsibility. She remained close to her mother, whose influence now intensified. Observers later described Beatrice as composed and self-contained, qualities shaped in these formative years. She learned to master her emotions and to place loyalty above personal inclination. At the same time, her awareness of the political reality surrounding her family deepened. Titles and privileges, she understood, were not merely protective shields. They carried obligations and exposed vulnerabilities. The illusion of permanence that surrounded dynastic life began to fade. In its place emerged a young woman, conscious of the limits imposed upon her future. This early confrontation with fragility prepared her for a life in which personal desires would repeatedly yield to the demands of dynasty and circumstance. At the dawn of the new century, a different future briefly seemed possible. Within the circle of Europe's royal courts, Beatrice grew close to Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich of Russia, the younger brother of Tsar Nicholas II. Their acquaintance deepened beyond formal courtesy. Letters passed between them in a tone that was personal and sincere, rare in a world governed by protocol. For the first time, Beatrice allowed herself to imagine a life shaped not solely by obligation, but by affection. Yet the promise of that bond was fragile from the outset. Michael stood near the Russian throne, and any decision he made carried dynastic weight. The true obstacle, however, was religious law. Beatrice and Michael were first cousins. Under the rules of the Russian Orthodox Church, marriage between them was forbidden. What felt natural on a personal level proved unacceptable within the rigid framework of empire and faith. The separation unfolded without scandal, but not without consequence. Beatrice outwardly accepted the decision with dignity. Inwardly, the experience marked her deeply. She had learned that even genuine attachment held no authority in the life of a princess. Affection could be acknowledged, but it could not determine destiny. With the end of this relationship, one possible path closed forever. The idea that she might have stood one day beside the Russian throne dissolved quietly. Instead, the courts of Europe began to consider other alliances. One of those would lead her towards Spain, a country that would bring both stability and turmoil in equal measure. The decisive turn in Beatrice's life came not through romance alone, but through circumstance and resolve. In 1906, she traveled to Spain to attend the wedding of King Alfonso XIII. Amid ceremony and political expectation, she encountered Prince Alfonso of Orléans-Bourbon, a cousin of the king and an officer in the Spanish army. Their connection did not ignite in spectacle. It developed steadily, grounded in mutual respect and shared composure. For Beatrice, this relationship was approached with caution. She had already experienced how fragile hope could be within royal life. Yet with Alfonso, she found steadiness rather than illusion. By the end of 1907, their engagement was announced. On a personal level, the Spanish king did not oppose the union. Institutionally, however, the marriage stirred resistance. The conflict lay not in sentiment, but in symbolism. Their union crossed religious boundaries and had been arranged without the formal authorization required by the Spanish court. In Spain, royal marriages were matters of state, not private choice. When the wedding took place outside Spanish territory in July 1909, it was perceived in Madrid as a breach of protocol and authority. The reaction was swift. Alfonso was stripped of his privileges as an infante, deprived of rank, titles, and military position. For Beatrice, the cost of choosing her own path became clear once again. What had promised stability now led to uncertainty and exclusion. The marriage that was meant to secure her future instead drew her into the center of political tension. The rupture with the Spanish court did not remain permanent. Over time, King Alfonso XIII moved discreetly to ease the tension. Though protocol had been violated, the king had never been personally hostile to the match. The birth of Beatrice and Alfonso's first son in 1910 marked a turning point. The marriage was no longer an impulsive defiance of authority, but an established family reality. Gradually, reconciliation followed. Alfonso was permitted to return to Spain and re-enter military service. Soon afterward, his titles and honors were formally restored, and his children were recognized with the rank and style appropriate to their position within the royal family. Official rehabilitation did not erase the earlier humiliation, but it reopened the door to court life. For Beatrice, the return required tact rather than triumph. She resumed public duties with restraint, appearing at official functions while carefully avoiding overt influence. Her attention centered increasingly on family life. 3 sons were growing up in a Europe that no longer seemed stable. She sought to provide them with the consistency that her own youth had lost. Yet beneath the restored appearances, uncertainty lingered. The monarchy into which she had re-entered projected strength, but internal tensions were already visible. Beatrice understood that acceptance could be withdrawn as swiftly as it had once been. Stability, she had learned, was rarely permanent. The outbreak of the First World War altered Beatrice's position once more. Although Spain remained neutral, the conflict divided opinion at court and cast suspicion on those with international ties. Beatrice's German lineage and her family connections across Europe became a source of quiet scrutiny. In a climate shaped by fear of diplomatic missteps, heritage itself could appear political. In 1916, the next rupture occurred. Under the pretext of a military assignment abroad, Alfonso was sent out of Spain, and Beatrice left with him. Officially, the departure was temporary. In reality, it amounted to a discreet removal from the center of power. The explanation remained vague. Allegations of German sympathies circulated, yet no formal accusation was ever proven. Beatrice firmly rejected such claims and even sought clarification from foreign representatives to dispel doubts. Her willingness to confront the rumors only deepened the sense that the reasons for her exclusion lay elsewhere. Historians have pointed to personal tensions within the royal household. Beatrice's independence, Her composure, and the evident stability of her marriage stood in contrast to the difficulties within the king's own domestic life. In an environment where perception shaped authority, distance became a convenient solution. Thus began a prolonged period away from Spain. The exile was neither openly declared nor clearly defined. It existed in ambiguity, leaving Beatrice suspended between belonging and exclusion. For a second time, she discovered how fragile acceptance could be within a monarchy that guarded its balance of influence with caution. The years spent away from Spain unfolded against a backdrop of continental upheaval. While Beatrice and her family lived outside the royal court, the political order of Europe was disintegrating. Empires that had once seemed eternal vanished within a few short years. In Germany, the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha ceased to exist as a sovereign entity. In Russia, revolution swept away the Romanov dynasty, and many of Beatrice's maternal relatives met tragic ends or were driven into exile. For Beatrice, these transformations were not distant headlines but personal fractures. The dynasties that had defined her childhood identity collapsed one after another. Financial resources tied to those realms diminished or disappeared entirely. Networks of protection dissolved. The world in which she had been raised, structured by lineage and continuity, no longer stood intact. When the war ended, the justification for her continued absence from Spain weakened. By the mid-1920s, she was allowed to return, though her life remained deliberately restrained and distant from political prominence. In this period, she took a decisive personal step. Her formal reception into the Catholic Church signaled not only spiritual conviction but also a declaration of belonging. After years of suspicion, she chose unequivocally to align herself with Spain. Yet the sense of stability proved temporary. Political currents within Spain were shifting rapidly. The monarchy faced mounting challenges, and the structure Beatrice had struggled to re-enter once again appeared uncertain. She had witnessed the fall of empires abroad. Now she stood on the threshold of upheaval in her adopted homeland. In 1931, the proclamation of the Second Spanish Republic ended the monarchy's authority. King Alfonso XIII departed the country, and Beatrice, once again, found herself living in the shadow of political transformation. This second displacement differed from the earlier exile. It was not the result of court intrigue, but the consequence of a nation redefining itself. The framework that had once rejected her now ceased to exist altogether. During the years that followed, Spain descended into civil war. Beatrice's husband returned to serve on the nationalist side, accepting responsibility in a conflict that would reshape the country. For Beatrice, these years were marked by uncertainty and quiet endurance. The most painful moment came with the death of her middle son, who fell during the war. The loss struck deeper than any political setback. Titles could be restored, reputations could shift, but a son could not be replaced. After the conflict ended, Beatrice returned permanently to Spain. She withdrew from political life and devoted herself to charitable work, maintaining dignity without seeking prominence. Among her quieter contributions was her association with the design of the emblem later adopted by the Spanish Air Force, a symbol that endured beyond her lifetime. Beatrice died in 1966. With her passing, one of the last living witnesses to the interconnected monarchies of 19th-century Europe disappeared. Her life did not unfold as a tale of unbroken privilege, but as a testament to resilience amid collapse. In her story, the grandeur of empire gives way to endurance, and the memory of a vanished world lingers in silence.